Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The Alberta government announces some much-needed help for those battling a rare genetic disease known as spinal muscular atrophy. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation says enough is enough and has launched a campaign to fight what Albertans have been paying in equalization payments. And one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilly, stops by to explain how the Trudeau Liberals have dropped the ball when it comes to the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Lethbridge police were called out to a tense situation on the west side of the city earlier this afternoon. Police asked the public to avoid the 500 block area of Blackfoot Manor West as they were dealing with the situation around 4 p.m. this afternoon. The critical incident team was called out to assist the situation. We'll have more for you as the information becomes available. The Alberta government announced funding help today for those who are battling spinal muscular atrophy. SMA is a rare genetic disease which impacts the lives of thousands of Albertans. It leads to progressive muscle weakness and paralysis, and the most severe form can lead to death for most patients under the age of 2. Health Minister Tyler Shandro says that 1 in 6,000 babies is born with the disease in Alberta. The national average is 1 in 10,000. Shandro says the province is working with pharmaceutical company Novartis and will immediately pay for the drug Zolgensma, which he says is an effective treatment in helping those battle the disease.
I'm very aware of the urgency of making this treatment available, and am pleased that we are able to provide this funding for children who may slip through the cracks while waiting for the final review and the final approval processes.
The province released its COVID-19 numbers late today. Over the past 24 hours, 459 new cases were identified. Officials say 604 people are still in hospital with the virus, including 110 in intensive care. There were also 12 additional deaths related to COVID-19. Dr. Dean Henshaw says there are 8,203 active cases in the province, and fortunately, 112,558 Albertans have recovered from the novel coronavirus. Looking across the province, it's great to see that some of the numbers are coming down, but the Calgary zone still has the most active cases right now at 3,252. The Edmonton zone is next at 2,862. The North Zone has 1,009 active cases. The Central Zone, which includes Red Deer, has 712. And here in the South Zone, just 355 active cases of COVID-19. Lethbridge has 118 cases, and in Medicine Hat, there are just 21. Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dean Henshaw, responded to a comment earlier today about reports of restaurants in rural parts of the province opening to full capacity in defiance of Alberta's current public health restrictions.
It is understandable that people are feeling frustrated with measures, and I know in some places in the province, people may not be seeing COVID cases in their particular area, but it is important to know that in all 3 of our rural zones, as well as our urban zones, we continue to see hospitalization putting pressure on the system in certain locations. And our healthcare system is a provincial one, and we need to think about that as an integrated system. I recognize again that these restrictions have been difficult for many business owners, and individuals who are choosing to move ahead in this way. What I would say is that these actions could potentially put at risk the sacrifices that we've made and this progress that we've made.
The Lethbridge School Division says there are 4 confirmed cases of COVID-19 at Gilbert Patterson Middle School. Officials say the school will remain open. Alberta Health Services has proceeded with defining close contacts of the 4 cases, and those 4 will be contacted via email. The 4 cases means the school is under a COVID alert. An alert means there are 1 to 4 cases at the school. An outbreak is now identified as 5 or more cases. The president of the union, which represents Cargill Meat in High River and JBS Foods in Brooks, says the province isn't doing enough to protect its essential workers. Thomas Hess of UFCW 401 is calling on the government to create a plan that includes pandemic pay increases, additional health and safety measures, and priority COVID-19 vaccines for those who are interested.
They need hope. They want to access the vaccines. They want a safe workplace now, and they want answers to their questions about vaccines, so they ensure that they are safe, absolutely safe, before someone's putting a needle in their body. And we're talking to our members right now We have thousands of them who are bringing food to the tables of Albertans, and we're talking to them about how they feel about vaccines. Don't call us heroes and then not treat us like heroes. So number one, they want a safe workplace. Number two, they want access to a safe vaccine. And they believe, given the work that they're doing, that they should fall in some sort of priority group.
The union will host a town hall meeting Sunday to hear members' views on vaccination. The COVID-19 pandemic has prompted a booming demand for pets from Canadians feeling isolated after months and months of physical distancing. That has created big opportunities for a slew of pet stores, which cater to those craving for companionship. As Loris Alexander explains now, customers are putting their money where the paws are.
Dog and Biscuit Lethbridge South opened up on February 29th, 2020, and just 3 weeks later, a worldwide pandemic was declared.
Panic. It was very stressful for the first couple of weeks or month or so because everybody was so uncertain of what would happen. Are we going to close, like be forced to close? We really had to change how we did business. So we did, still are doing curbside pickup and home deliveries. And so that changed a lot. And
Canadians kept trying to fill voids with canine companions, either because they were stuck working from home with children who needed something to do, or had no work and lots of free time, or felt lonely with no way to socialize.
a lot of people are now staying home, working from home, or whether they've lost their job or, all those circumstances. And we saw a huge increase in dog and cat adoptions. And so that was pretty fun. I mean, usually every spring there are big increases, but I think this year it was definitely more noticeable. And so it was fun because everyone was coming in and needing all the new necessities for their puppies. Research the breed or the type of pet you're getting. I think a lot of the times people just think, oh, this dog is so cute, and they just hop right in. And that works out, definitely, but there's also certain breeds that have maybe more energy and need more attention and more walks and stuff. So I would look into that, and if you maybe need more of a lap dog versus more of a mountain climbing dog, look at the breeds that way.
For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
The Southern Alberta Art Gallery is hosting an interactive publication workshop for February, which is Black History Month. The Zoom event, which will be held on February 14th from 2 till 4, will walk through various topics that highlight some of North America's darkest moments in history. It'll finish with a poetry reading from Black artists throughout the ages. The event, titled The Blackness of Blackness, hopes to educate all Southern Albertans.
Some Black people will have my book and honestly feel a sense of Black community, even in a place like Lethbridge where there's not necessarily a million Black people, but we can find each other in certain pockets. And for white people, I said, in my foreword, I actually mentioned this. I hope that Black or white people or non-white, non-Black people of color and white people reading this book will hopefully understand that Black people are a very beautiful, calm, serene people. And we're also not meant to be categorized as one specific race, if that makes sense. We're not just one human being. We're all individuals, and we're glorious, glorious individuals.
The virtual event will be $20, and you can get pamphlets with more information mailed to you starting on February the 3rd. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has launched a Fight Equalization campaign to oppose equalization in the provincial referendum being held this October. The Alberta Director of the CTF, Franco Terrazzano, joins me now from Calgary and has more information. Franco, I guess it's safe to say you agree with Premier Jason Kenney that Alberta has been sending way too much money to Ottawa and needs to fight for a fair deal. What does that fair deal really look like?
We're not getting a fair deal right now. That's so clear. I mean, since the 1960s, Alberta taxpayers have paid more than $600 billion more to Ottawa, and by extension, the other provinces, than we've received back in federal spending. But we still have politicians and other provinces that seem to be getting their kicks from roadblocking our development. So it's pretty clear that it's not fair. And one of the key issues here is equalization, and we do need a fair equalization deal, and that's why we are leading the charge in this equalization referendum that is going to be coming up this October.
Now, with the energy sector hurting as much as it is right now, can the Trudeau Liberals expect Alberta to pony up billions of dollars more in transfer payments?
Well, this is one of the fundamental frustrations that Albertans are facing right now, right? We have continued to punch above our weight for the rest of Canada, but we're still dealing with damaging legislation from the feds. The No More Pipelines law, the discriminatory tanker ban. The feds lied to us and then massively hiked the carbon tax, and they're getting ready to hammer us with a second carbon tax. So there's one thing that is all too clear for Albertans, and it's that Trudeau is not going to give us a fair deal on a silver platter. And that's why we need to fight for fairness. And Albertans are ready to fight for fairness. We're sick and tired of being treated as the cash cow for the rest of Canada. And that's why this equalization referendum is so important, because it's our chance to send a clear message to Trudeau that the status quo must change.
That was the Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terrazzano, joining me from Calgary. A Calgary man is facing charges over allegations of trafficking teenage girls. Police say a suspect advertised 2 girls online and set up multiple encounters between them and other men. 29-year-old Harrison Brian Penny was arrested on Monday. He's charged with sexual assault, sexual interference, human trafficking, and possession of child pornography. 2 people have died in a house fire in west central Alberta. RCMP say the blaze broke out in a semi-detached home in Evansburg early Tuesday morning. The MP for Yellowhead, Gerald Soroka, posted on social media that 2 people died in the fire. Mounties say an officer was able to help 2 elderly people evacuate, but another woman and a teenager were unable to escape the fire. A GoFundMe page has been set up to support the family. A survey of 19 major police departments across Canada suggests that certain crimes are falling. The study says violent crimes have dropped 18% during the first 8 months of the pandemic. That compares to the same period in 2019. There was, however, a 2% year-over-year increase in cases of uttering threats by a family member. Stats Canada also found service calls rose 8%, particularly for wellness checks, calls for domestic disturbances, and mental health. Environment Canada has issued extreme cold warnings for the southern half of Manitoba and parts of southeastern Saskatchewan. The public health alerts warn of wind chills of -40 or colder. It says extreme cold puts everyone at risk, especially young children, the elderly, the homeless, and those who work outside. Environment Canada is a reminder that if it's too cold for people to stay outside, it's also too cold for pets to be outside as well. Saskatchewan is extending a public health order banning visits to private households until February the 19th. It is among COVID-19 restrictions that were set to expire on Friday. The extension comes as the province reported 232 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 and sadly, 14 more deaths today. The province is also reporting a record 839 recoveries, leaving it with 2,665 cases still considered active. Beginning Friday, Manitobans who return home from traveling anywhere outside their province, including Western Canada, will have to self-isolate for 2 weeks. Premier Brian Pallister says the rule is necessary to prevent the spread of variants of COVID-19, some of which appear to be more deadly than previous strains. The province says there could be exceptions for people who have property in Ontario's cottage country. Manitoba reported 92 new cases yesterday, along with 5 more deaths attributed to the virus. Some good news for those who live in central Canada. COVID-19 infections continue to trend lower in both Ontario and Quebec. Ontario had a 7-week low of 1,670 new COVID-19 cases reported, while Quebec reported 1,328. Quebec Premier François Legault's government says it will not challenge a temporary court order that exempts the homeless from a province-wide curfew imposed to limit the spread of the virus. Community workers urged the Premier to exempt the homeless after a man was found dead this month in a portable toilet not far from a Montreal homeless shelter. 3 people who allegedly supplied ammunition to the gunman who murdered 22 people in Nova Scotia last April were arraigned in court today. They included the killer's 52-year-old spouse, Lisa Banfield, 64-year-old James Blair Banfield, and 60-year-old Brian Brewster were also charged with unlawfully transferring ammunition. Police have said that the 3 had no prior knowledge of the actions of the gunman. The gunman, who posed as a police officer, Gabriel Wortman, was shot and killed by police following the killing spree last spring. Federal Conservative trade critic Tracy Gray is demanding to know what Canada is doing to seek an exemption from the Biden administration's Buy American policy. Canada's international trade minister says the Liberals are working hard with U.S. President Joe Biden on the issue.
First, the U.S. administration canceled Keystone XL. Now they have announced Buy America policies on their government procurement. This will be devastating to our exports of Canadian aluminum, steel, and many manufacturing and wholesale sectors who rely on integrated supply chains with the United States. What is the Prime Minister doing to ensure Canada is exempted from these policies? Or will he again just express his disappointment like he did with Keystone?
To Canadian businesses and workers, I want you to know that we are actively engaging with our American partners at all levels and will always stand up for the best interest of Canadians. The Prime Minister spoke to President Biden and they affirm that they will and we will be working together, consulting closely. Canada and the U.S. share a unique relationship. We're going to continue working with our Canadian businesses, our exporters. We're going to take a Team Canada approach. We've been doing this for the last 5 years.
When it comes to COVID-19 vaccine procurement and distribution, one of our regular contributors, political reporter Brian Lilly, says the Liberal government has dropped the ball. He says while some countries are suing due to COVID-19 vaccine shortage, Canada is not doing much at all.
According to the Associated Press, EU countries will get 92% of their vaccine doses across the 27-member trading bloc. Some countries have seen doses cut by as much as 50%. Poland and Romania, for example. Italy saw a cut of 20%, and they're threatening to sue. But Canada, 100% cut, 86% next week, according to some estimates, but it's at least 80%. And we don't know what we're getting the week of February 8th and February 15th.
Catch the entire interview with Mr. Lilly, who will also talk about a Liberal MP who was punted from the Liberal caucus. That's coming up later in our program. The Biden administration is boosting purchases of coronavirus vaccines to deliver enough to protect 300 million Americans by the end of the summer. It is also surging deliveries to states for the next few weeks and pledging to be more transparent.
After review of the current vaccine supply and manufacturing plans, I can announce that we will increase overall weekly vaccination distributions to states, tribes, and territories from 8.6 million doses to a minimum of 10 million doses. Starting next week, that's an increase of 1.4 million doses per week. And we believe that we'll soon be able to confirm the purchase of an additional 100 million doses for each of the two FDA-authorized vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. That's 100 million more doses of Pfizer and 100 million more doses of Moderna. 200 million more doses than the federal government had previously secured. Not in hand yet, but ordered.
Indonesia's most active volcano erupted earlier today with billowing smoke and a river of lava as searing gas clouds flowed 1,500 meters down its slopes. People in the region were warned to stay away from the 5-kilometer danger zone. The sounds of the eruption could be heard 30 kilometers away. The last time that Mount Merapi erupted was last November when close to 2,000 people had to evacuate. We had kind of a gray day in the Windy City with some light flurries and cooler temperatures, but good news is on the horizon. The mercury will be climbing. Complete weather details are coming up. We had another overcast and cool day in Lethbridge, but not a lot of snow, which is nice. Jeanette Rocher is here now with a complete look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, some of those clouds will be moving on, making way for some sunny days ahead.
Yeah, definitely some sunny days ahead beginning tomorrow and also some plus temperatures for the weekend, something to look forward to. But first, this evening, overnight low tonight right here, -18. Going to feel much colder with that wind chill, more like -25, feeling like -24 into tomorrow morning. But we're going to rise up to -8 with lots of sunshine. So there is some good news there. -7 the high for Friday with sunny skies. A very sunny weekend ahead of us. 4 degrees is our high for Saturday and a lovely 7 degrees on a Sunday. We're going to see a 30% chance of flurries on Monday with a high of -1 overnight. On Monday night into Tuesday, we're looking at a 60% chance of snow, and then into Tuesday, a 40% chance of snow with a high of -5 for next Tuesday. So we're certainly getting out of that range sometimes in our overnight lows, getting lower than the -13 average low for this time of year. Average high -1. 13 was our high temperature back in 1988, and our chilliest day on record was in 1972, and it was -38 degrees. 8:10 was the sunrise this morning, and our sunset this evening right at 5:18 p.m. So let's take a look at what's happening across the country for highs tomorrow. Over on the west coast, a chance of rain tomorrow in both Victoria and Vancouver, both of those sitting steady at 6 degrees. Minus 14 the high in Edmonton with a mix of sun and cloud. Minus 13 the high in Calgary, also with partly cloudy skies. 15 km/h winds expected in both Calgary and Edmonton tomorrow. Now the prairies have been under frigid cold with a Arctic ridge high pressure coming in. That's pretty much subsided, so those horrible temperatures aren't sticking around, but we still got the minuses. Minus 12 in Saskatoon, minus 10 Regina, minus 14 tomorrow in Winnipeg. Of course, going to feel chillier with those wind chills. In Toronto tomorrow, minus 6 with a chance of flurries. Mainly overcast skies tomorrow in Ottawa. Minus 12 the high there, minus 9 in Montreal with a mix of sun and cloud. Over in Atlantic Canada, what's happening in the Maritimes? Well, we will tell you. Fredericton's high minus 1 with a chance of flurries. Lots of sunshine happening in this area here. Halifax and Charlottetown, 1 degree the high for Halifax. Minus 3 for Charlottetown, not too bad. Minus 4 the high in St. John's, Newfoundland, and also expecting some flurries there. So there you go, that is your forecast.
Today's weather is brought to you, rain or shine, by the Gym in the North. Start your New Year's resolution today.
Empire's announced plans to convert 7 of its Safeway stores in Western Canada and Ontario to its discount brand FreshCo. The Nova Scotia-based company announced a 5-year plan in 2017 to convert 25% of its full-service Safeway and Sobeys locations to FreshCo stores. 6 of the latest conversions will be in Alberta and the other located in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Empire says affected employees will be offered the opportunity to work at the new locations or at other stores within the company. Many who advocate for green energy say that thousands of jobs will be created and money will be saved once we further embrace the technology. That's not necessarily true, according to an economics professor at the University of Guelph. Ross McKittrick says by relying less on fossil fuels, it may actually cost you more money.
Representatives of the renewable fuels industry or the wind energy industry coming along and saying, don't worry, there'll be lots of jobs in these new sectors. Typically, though, for instance, our experience in Ontario, going the green energy route, they said it wouldn't affect electricity prices, but the reality was our prices more than doubled. And they said that it would create a lot of new jobs. And the reality was that because of the increased electricity prices and the loss of manufacturing that went along with that, we lost at least 2 jobs for every job that was created in the renewable energy sector.
Catch the full interview with Professor Ross McKittrick and Jeanette Rocher, who will discuss the clean fuel standard coming up after business news. Boeing is reporting another huge loss. This one because of a setback of its 777X wide-body jetliner. The company says it lost $8.4 billion US in the 4th quarter. Boeing is pushing back the expected first delivery of the jet by a year because of tougher standards for certifying new aircraft and weaker demand for international travel. Its smaller 737 MAX only recently returned to flying after being grounded around the world for 20 months following 2 deadly crashes. Navistar says it plans to begin selling low-emission hydrogen-powered heavy trucks in about 3 years under a new venture announced today. The partnership with General Motors and a small company called 1H2 is an early commercial deployment of the technology in long-haul trucking. Navistar says it hopes it'll start widespread use of the hydrogen electric trucks, which will reduce greenhouse gas emissions that come from burning diesel fuel. GM will provide fuel cells for Navistar, while 1H2 will set up fueling stations by trucking hydrogen to terminals or through small hydrogen generation units. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 354 points on the day to finish at 17,424. The Dow was down 633 points to 30,303. The S&P 500 was down 98 points to 3751, and the Nasdaq was down 355 points to 13,271. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 4 cents to 52.65 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 10 cents to 2.76 US. Gold was down 7 cents to 18.4391 US an ounce, and silver was unchanged on the day at 25.27 US an ounce. Wheat is at $297 per metric ton, barley's at $302, canola's at $713, and corn is at $338 per metric ton. Live cattle were down 55 cents to 116.45, feeder cattle were down 3 cents to 135.63, and lean hogs were up 13 cents to 70.58. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 78.12 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, the Alberta government announced funding help today for those who are battling spinal muscular atrophy. SMA is a rare genetic disease which impacts the lives of thousands of Albertans. It leads to progressive muscle weakness and paralysis, and in the most severe form can lead to death for most patients under the age of 2. Alberta Health Minister Tyler Shandro says the province is working with the pharmaceutical company Novartis and will immediately pay for the drug Zolgensma, which he says is an effective treatment at helping those battle SMA. When it comes to providing a COVID-19 vaccine for Canadians, the Trudeau Liberals are not faring very well. That's according to political reporter Brian Lilley. Brian will have more details for us coming up in just a moment. Apparently, the Trudeau Liberals knew about the problems with the Chinese vaccine partnership just days after the Prime Minister announced the deal, according to documents tabled in the House of Commons. To talk about this and other big issues from the Hill is political reporter Brian Lilley from the Toronto Sun. Brian, why did the Liberals keep this hidden from us for so many months?
They kept it hidden for about 2 months, and they kept the hopes for the deal ahead until late August. And yet, days after the Prime Minister first spoke about this deal on May 16th, the government found out there were problems. So let me give you a timeline on this. On May 6th, the National Research Council signed a deal with CanSino Biologics to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. CanSino Biologics at that point was considered one of the leading contenders for a COVID-19 vaccine. They'd already been approved for human trials in China. They were going to find other countries to partner with, other research labs to partner with for these human trials. So they signed the deal on May 6th. On May 12th, the deal is announced. You know, as often happens, it's days later once you get all the I's dotted and T's crossed. May 12th, they announced the deal. May 16th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, at one of his Rideau Cottage updates, he was still doing them pretty much daily at that point, he came out and he talked about the deal and said this is good, and if this works out, we'll be able to make the vaccine here in Canada, which we really wish we could at this point. But May 19th, the government of Canada found out that the Chinese government was blocking shipments of what they call the vaccine seeds, the ingredients to make sure that the vaccine would work here, that they could develop it here, that they could do the clinical trials here. 3 days after the Prime Minister, but the public didn't find out until July. The government kept hoping until late August that this was going to be a possibility, and the Prime Minister defended it. This is a big part of the reason that Canada is behind other countries in getting its population vaccinated, and it's one of the reasons that the Trudeau government is facing so much pressure, so many questions, especially now that we've got problems with other vaccines and doses not showing up.
What's interesting, there's a Calgary-based company now that's come out with, I think it's Providence Therapeutics is coming out with human trials with their vaccine, but it won't be ready until the end of the year, so before we can try it on people again. Now, Brian, while Canada was dealing with 0 vaccines being delivered this week and a cut of 80% or more for next week, countries in Europe are not facing the same kind of cut. Brian, there's talk that the EU is considering banning exports of key vaccines for Canada.
So many problems around what's going on with Pfizer and potentially Moderna. Moderna so far has been a partner that has delivered when they said. They've been delivering every 3 weeks. Pfizer was supposed to be doing weekly deliveries and was faring well. You know, sometimes there'd be a few doses short, a few thousand doses short, but when you're talking about 200,000 doses being delivered, okay, so you're off by 4,000, not a big deal. We will manage. Maybe next time we'll get a few thousand doses more. This week we're getting 0 doses. Now, if you remember on January 15th, the minister in charge of procuring vaccines, Anita Anand, actually announced that, well, this is something that's going to affect all countries. This is something that everyone obtaining their vaccine from the Belgian plant is going to deal with. And it'll be about a 50% cut for 4 weeks while the plant retools and is able to produce more vaccines faster. That's not what has happened. European countries, according to the Associated Press, EU countries will get 92% of their vaccine doses across the 27-member trading bloc. Some countries have seen doses cut by as much as 50%. Poland and Romania, for example. Italy saw a cut of 20%, and they're threatening to sue. But Canada, 100% cut, 86% next week, according to some estimates, but it's at least 80%. And we don't know what we're getting the week of February 8th and February 15th. The Prime Minister couldn't answer that question when asked earlier this week. So, you put that against the backdrop of the EU now saying we may ban the export of COVID vaccines until we are looked after. And Canada is in a bad spot because Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, which will soon be approved by Health Canada, are all manufactured in Europe. That's where we would get our doses from, and it's going to leave us in a bad spot.
Brian, this week marks 1 year since the first case of COVID-19 arrived in Canada. Now, a year ago, you were documenting how the first case slipped through our ineffective screening system, and a year later, you say data shows cases are still slipping through.
Well, we've got these new variants that are coming in, the British variant, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant showing up in Canada. They're coming in via travel. These don't spontaneously appear inside our population. So, we know that they're coming in through travel through various ways. But it was a year ago, you're right, that the first case showed up. It was a man from Richmond Hill, Ontario, arrived in Canada after going home to visit family for the Lunar New Year in Wuhan, China. He came back after a couple of weeks in China, saw the signs, saw the documentation saying you've got to alert us if you've been to Wuhan. He said, yes, I've been to Wuhan. Are you feeling any symptoms? Well, I've got a cough. And they said, okay, on you go. And they let him go home. That man should have been quarantined on the spot, as should have his wife been. My understanding is that they both did recover, thankfully. They did survive. But that shows you how weak it was at the beginning. Now we've got the data from the Calgary airport showing 1.5% of the people arriving in Calgary that they test after they touch down are testing positive for COVID-19. That is, may seem like a small number. Epidemiologists say, no, that's disturbingly high. In Toronto, at the airport here, it's about 2.4% of the people that they're testing through their voluntary program that are testing positive for COVID-19. And that program launched after the federal government said you need a COVID negative test just to board a plane to come to Canada. So obviously people are slipping through. We've had more than 100 flights with COVID positive people arrive since this requirement of a negative test on January 7th. People are slipping through. We need to start taking this more seriously.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been talking about tougher measures at the border and with flights. What will some of those tougher measures potentially look like?
Well, what Premier Ford would like is mandatory testing because Pearson Airport in Toronto is the busiest one in the country, especially for international flights. And they can't even get the feds to agree with what there is happening in Calgary. There's only 4 airports that are taking regularly scheduled international flights: Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Montreal. And we're not testing people that are arriving. So that's a big request. But some premiers have told the Prime Minister they want him to go further. There is data out there showing that people are not following the quarantine order. So we brought in the quarantine order 2 months after the first case touchdown on March 25th, 2020. Some anonymized cell data shows that about 23% of the time, people that are supposed to be home and quarantining, they're out and about in the community, which means some of them are going to be COVID positive, some of them are going to spread it in the community, and then people don't know where they got it. They say, well, I wasn't traveling, I don't know where it came from, and so on and so on and so on. It's like the old shampoo ad, they told 2 friends and they told 2 friends, and it just gets worse. So they'd like to see the Prime Minister either shut down leisure travel, so all those flights from Cancun to Calgary would be shut down. They'd like to see him say, you know what, if you're going to travel, you have to stay in a hotel on your own dime for 2 weeks when you come back. No more going home and skirting the rules. You're going to pay for it. It's part of your flight. Just consider the cost before you leave. But other countries are doing that. We could see that soon.
But you know what? If we're going to talk about canceling travel, maybe we should start with the politicians, the federal and provincial politicians. Have them
I
stay
would
home
agree.
first. Lead by example, right? Now, the Biden administration's first order of business was to kill the Keystone XL pipeline expansion, Brian. Now, the Biden camp is talking protectionist measures with its Buy America campaign. So is the Trudeau government going to fight for Canadian businesses or just kind of roll over the way they did for Keystone?
You know, one of the saddest things that I saw was the Trudeau government immediately turn and say, well, you know, it's time to move on. That was Environment Minister John Wilkinson. That was our ambassador in Washington, who, by the way, will only say things that the government actually tells her to say. That's her job. I'm not picking on her, but that's her job. The Trudeau government does not want to fight for Keystone. Sadly, a poll from Angus Reid Institute shows that outside of Saskatchewan and Alberta, most Canadians say, time to move on. But yet when it comes to standing up for other industries, the Prime Minister was asked about that this week, and he was stood there and proudly talked about all the times he stood up to Donald Trump on aluminum and steel and supply management for dairy farmers and all these other issues. And, you know, in one case, Hal, they brought in countervailing tariffs on American products the same day the Americans announced a new tariff on aluminum and steel. The same day. But yet when it comes to oil and gas, they're not willing to fight. So he says he'll stand up to Joe Biden on Buy American. I'm not sure that he will, but let me tell you, the pressure from vote-rich regions of Ontario and Quebec will be very difficult for him to resist, because there's an awful lot of manufacturing that goes on here, and they sell parts into the United States. Well, if it's a government contract, those parts, those companies are going to be banned. That's going to be a huge economic hit. And he's already rolled over on Keystone, so why won't he roll over on this? That will be the view of the Biden administration, which, you know, let me remind you, Joe Biden was part of the Obama administration, which had some of the toughest Buy American restrictions during the 2008-2009 economic recovery plan.
Brian, a big story we had last week was the resignation of Julie Payette as Governor General, a story I believe you broke first. Now, there have been stories about a toxic work environment for many months at the Governor General's office. What finally made her leave? Was the promise of the over $140,000 pension for life?
Well, I think it was more the report that was going to come out, and the report was apparently damning. Now, I've also been told that the report was a report, but not an investigation, that they listened to people who say, oh, she's an awful boss, but they didn't investigate to say, okay, well, how was she an awful boss? Was there any merit to the claims? Look, the civil service in Ottawa can be sleepy at the best of times, but Rideau Hall is among the sleepiest. So I think that there is probably a lot of truth to what was said about Julie Payette and how she was as a manager. But I also think that there were issues around the civil service not being used to having a demanding manager and people that expect things to be completed by deadline. So a bit of column A and column B. But by the time the report came out, Julie Payette was just exhausted and ready to say enough is enough. The pension, by the way, is going to be a lot less than she was earning before she was Governor General, and a lot less than what she was earning as Governor General.
As for finding a replacement for Ms. Payette, will the Prime Minister go back to using a nonpartisan committee?
He would not commit to that. I mean, this is part of the problem with appointing Julie Payette, is she was the hand-picked candidate of Justin Trudeau in his Prime Minister's office. They did not do vetting. It took the media a matter of hours to start finding embarrassing stories and embarrassing questions for the government on Ms. Payette and her appointment. Hours, not days, hours. The government did not vet. Prior to the appointment of Julie Payette, there was a nonpartisan committee that was set up by the Harper Conservatives, and their job was to look at potential candidates and give the government a short list. The Trudeau Liberals got rid of that, and when asked, will you go back to it, which everyone thinks it's a good idea, Prime Minister Trudeau would not commit.
Now, we chatted last week about the federal Conservatives kicking social conservative Derek Sloan out of their caucus. This week, it's the Liberals who are parting ways with one of their own. Who would that be?
It's a Brampton Liberal MP named Ramesh Sangha. And he was kicked out not for being an extremist, but for saying that the Liberal Party has extremists inside of it. We're talking about Khalistani extremists. Now, if you don't know the Khalistani issue, these are people that believe that the Indian region of Punjab should separate from India and become a Sikh national homeland. So there is a religious element to this, but a heavy politicized one. And not all Sikhs want to do this. In fact, the current chief minister of Punjab is an observant Sikh named Captain Singh, and he took the Trudeau government to task. If you remember Trudeau's horrible trip to India, where it was just embarrassment after embarrassment, at first, the man in charge of Punjab, essentially the premier, I guess would be the closest equivalent, would not meet with the prime minister until he saw statements from Trudeau and ministers saying, we don't support an independence movement for Punjab. Well, this Liberal MP, Ramesh Sangha, says there are still radicals inside. This was an interview that he did on Punjabi language media in Brampton after the resignation of Navdeep Bains. He claims that Bains is one of these people. He also claims others are, like Harjit Sajjan, the defense minister. Now, I couldn't find statements from Bains distancing himself from this. I'm not saying that he is a Khalistani extremist, but I'm saying I couldn't find the statements. But there have been statements from Harjit Sajjan. So, obviously a lot of hurt within the Liberal Party over this. But when Conservatives are accused of flirting with any type of extremism, there are questions after questions. The Liberals are trying to sweep this under the rug. I say more questions have to be asked.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilly, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.
The federal government continues its fight against climate change with a number of bills and proposals. Some say this is making for great progress. Others believe it's highly ineffective. Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Ross McKittrick, a professor of economics at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Dr. McKittrick, thank you so much for joining me today via Skype from Guelph.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Absolutely. Now, you wrote an article in the Financial Post on the proposed federal CFS, or Clean Fuel Standard. Can you tell us what exactly the Clean Fuel Standard requires from us?
Well, the standard is it's not directed at ordinary air pollution. It's directed at trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is released from the fuel being burned. And the only way you can really do that is to blend in various forms of biofuels. So it'll mean blending in more ethanol into gasoline and biogas into natural gas. And the hope is that on a life cycle or an engineering basis, there's less carbon dioxide emissions from that blended fuel. The effect of this will be, because these are more expensive fuel streams, biogas and ethanol are more expensive to produce than regular fuel, it will raise the cost of fuels. Depending on how stringent the target is, one estimate from the Canadian Energy Research Institute is that the price of natural gas could be pushed up by about 60% to fully comply with this rule. They may not push it that far. It's still a bit hard to tell, but it'll also add probably 5 to 10 cents per liter to the price of gasoline. And the effect of this, the government hopes they will reduce national carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by about 30 megatons, which would get us partway to the Paris climate target, but certainly wouldn't be enough to get us there.
Right. So although the term biofuel may sound good because it requires fertilizer, water, and land to produce, that process itself can increase pollution. And some say it costs more in energy to produce than you would actually end up saving. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, that is right. If you start with, for instance, a crop of corn, to turn it into ethanol is a very energy-intensive process. And a lot of it is actually done in the United States, where they use electricity from a very fossil fuel-intensive electricity grid. So that's why when we look at the actual emission reduction from switching to ethanol, you have to look at it on this life cycle basis. And if it's in the end, if it's actually the case that you get lower emissions from ethanol, it's not lower by much. It's lower at the tailpipe level, but it's on the life cycle basis. Some estimates are that depending on where you get the ethanol from, we actually would increase total emissions.
Okay, so the whole point of the clean fuel standard is to reduce carbon emissions from the use of fossil fuels. But we already have a carbon tax that's being imposed. So why do we also need the CFS forced upon producers and consumers?
Yeah, that's a good question. The rationale for the carbon tax is it gives everybody a financial incentive to find the cheapest way possible to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. In economics, we like those kinds of policies because then you can say, all right, we're going to agree on how much emission reduction we're going to achieve. This is the way to do it at the lowest possible cost. But that only works if then the government stands back and lets the system work. If they let the market find those solutions under the incentive of the carbon tax. What they're doing here is actually undermining the carbon tax because they're saying to the fuel producers and the fuel users, all right, you still have to pay the carbon tax, but we're also going to add this extra set of rules. Specifically, you have to blend in all these biofuels into the liquid and gas stream. And it's happening at a much higher cost than the cost of complying with the carbon tax. So they've really unraveled the efficiency aspect of the carbon tax doing it this way, but of course they're still requiring us to pay it.
Yeah, this doesn't sound like an economically feasible plan, but will it actually make a difference? Will it reduce carbon emissions significantly, especially as our population continues to grow and demand for fuel continues as well?
There's a conflict between the goal of reaching the Paris targets and holding our emissions permanently below the target level, and also trying to increase the workforce much more rapidly than we've done in the past. And the government's trying to pursue both goals at once. The reality is that the population growth that they have in mind over the next few years will more than offset any of the reductions from the clean fuel standard. We ran into this problem with the Kyoto Protocol many years ago. A lot of people have forgotten all about that, but the government of the day signed a treaty in Kyoto promising to get our emissions down by a fairly ambitious amount and keep them down after 2010. And then it just turned out to be very expensive to do that because the technology isn't available that would let us use fossil fuels the way we do in a large, cold, spread out country like we have. We can't use fossil fuels to run our cars and heat our homes and get emissions down by the amount that they promised. So we ended up abandoning the Kyoto commitment. We're going to run into the same problem with Paris, that the government they can put these policies forward. They're very expensive to try. In the end, they don't actually accomplish what the government hopes that they will. And so something's got to give at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Why is net zero so important to the government? Why do we have to get there regardless of costs? Carbon dioxide in and of itself isn't a pollutant. Is it not, in fact, very necessary for a healthy planet?
Well, yeah, carbon dioxide has never been regulated in the past because it's not a local air contaminant. We regulate carbon monoxide and particulates and sulfur dioxide and other forms of local air pollution. But we didn't used to regulate carbon dioxide because, as you say, it is a natural part of the atmosphere and it's essential for plant life. What's happening now, though, is with fossil fuel consumption, that does release carbon dioxide emissions. And the concern is that over the long term, that can have an effect on the climate. And so the idea of going to net zero carbon dioxide emissions, which is a far more radical target even than the Paris Accord targets, the government seems to have adopted that without much in the way of a discussion with the public about why we need to do that, how much it would cost, and whether there would even be any benefits of doing it. And even though they pushed the deadline forward into the future, they are already proposing, like the clean fuel standard, some policies that if they go ahead with them, they will be very expensive for people. And I think people deserve a better accounting from the government about why it is that they think this is so important to do and just how much they expect people to pay.
Interesting. Now, green activists argue that clean energy will be an economic boost to Canada And we shouldn't worry about the fossil fuel industry ending because we can quickly replace it with green energy. So how realistic is that?
It's not at all realistic. I've been hearing the same thing now for 20 years or more. Every time the government proposes one of these policies, you will have environmentalists and also sometimes the representatives of the renewable fuels industry or the wind energy industry coming along and saying, don't worry, there'll be lots of jobs in these new sectors. Typically, though, for instance, our experience in Ontario, going the green energy route, they said it wouldn't affect electricity prices, but the reality was our prices more than doubled. And they said that it would create a lot of new jobs. And the reality was that because of the increased electricity prices and the loss of manufacturing that went along with that, we lost at least 2 jobs for every job that was created in the renewable energy sector. And then the renewable energy sector jobs are only temporary anyway. Once the turbines are built and the solar panels are built, there aren't really ongoing jobs in that sector. So it is not the case that green energy is an economic opportunity. If it was an economic opportunity, you wouldn't need to force people to do it. The market would just pursue the opportunity the way people pursue any other profitable opportunity. The reason we have these policies is precisely because the market realizes these are money-losing industries and they don't create jobs.
Interesting point. Now, you point out also that we all want clean fuel, but apparently for every dollar of environmental benefit from the CFS, we actually lose $6 of income and wealth. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so that comes from tallying up the costs of compliance with the regulation and then also the indirect cost to the rest of the economy from the higher fuel prices and the reduction in the value of investments and things like that. And then, so you have that on one side of the ledger. And then on the other side, we look at, well, what are the benefits of reducing the emissions? And right now, the government sets the carbon tax rate based on scientific estimates of what is the benefit of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And so if we take the maximum value from that schedule and we say, okay, we'll value the emission reductions using the government's own estimate, then it turns out the costs of the policy are 6 times larger than the benefits. So we can say, yeah, we'll take the government at its word that these emission reductions are valuable, but that's not the end of the story. We are incurring much larger costs to get those emission reductions. And going back to the point of the carbon tax, one of the essential pieces of logic of the carbon tax is it says we'll pursue emission reductions, but only up to the point where the costs of further reductions end up costing more than the benefits. And that's why we initially would go with a carbon tax type policy, because then it ensures that you don't get into a situation like we are in with the clean fuel standard where we're getting emission reductions, but the costs are far in excess of the benefits.
Now, the federal government also recently tabled new legislation, Bill C-12, that would force current and future federal governments to set binding climate targets to get Canada to net zero carbon by 2050. Any thoughts on what this means for Canadians? Should we be concerned about potential increases in taxes? And what about the impact this might have on things like the cost of gas, groceries, home heating, and anything we purchase?
Yeah, these are all valid concerns because in order to accomplish the goal, you have to make energy a lot more expensive. There's just no way you can function in a country like Canada without using energy. And if you are going to get people to use less energy, you have to make it more expensive. Now, the legislation, it's a bit tricky for one government to say they're going to bind all future governments to this plan. Really, all a government can do is bind itself to a plan, but they can't pass a law today that every government from now on is bound by, because a future government can always repeal the legislation if they want. I think the concern that's raised here, though, is just it signals that the current government is absolutely determined to pursue this path, and they are not particularly concerned about how much it's going to cost people, and they're not really listening to that side of the story.
Is anyone thinking about how excessive spending on climate change is impacting other areas where tax dollars would be put to much better use? Like maybe healthcare, education, fighting crime, reducing poverty. The list could go on.
Well, we think about that sort of thing in the economics profession. I don't think it's nearly prominent enough in the discussion. So going back to the green energy example in Ontario, because of these very high electricity prices, the government has said they're going to help some of our manufacturing and industry groups with lower electricity prices by transferring the cost of some of those expensive green energy contracts onto the taxpayer, basically putting it into the government budget. And that's going to be $3 to $3.5 billion per year just to get the burden off the manufacturing sector for the electricity costs. Now you think about what that means. That's a pharmacare program that we're not able to have because the money is going to cover these contracts. That's services for families with disabled children. That's upgrading hospitals in smaller communities. That's a lot of things that aren't going to happen because we are paying for contracts for electricity that we could have got much cheaper. We didn't need to pay that money in the first place. It's wasted money. And with something like the Clean Fuel Standard, you're asking people to pay maybe 50 or 60% more for the same natural gas that they were getting previously. And you have to ask, for what? And that's money out of household budgets. That's going to mean money out of farm budgets that they have to pass on to consumers in higher food prices. Yes, these are all absolutely legitimate questions. And the sad thing, as far as I can see, is that no, the government is not particularly interested in these questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. McKittrick, for your insight. Dr. Ross McKittrick, Professor of Economics at the University of Guelph and a Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.